one of the favorite TV shows at our house. Unfortunately, it's come to the end of its run, but it had 14 good seasons, and that's a show called Mythbusters, which you may have seen. And in its final season, they were kind of following up on some things that they had done before. And one of the experiments that they did, if you don't know about Mythbusters, is these two guys who had a lot of movie special effects experience, and they would take myths that they found on the internet, that they saw in movies, that they would hear about in many different places, and they would put them to scientific test. And one of the myths that they had heard of was that if you stand in the middle, equidistant, between two explosions, that the blast waves would cancel each other out. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? It's because it is. So here's what they did. And they really tried to do good science about it. So what they did is they did a control experiment. So they took 5 pounds of explosives, essentially a sugar bag. They took 5 pounds of explosives, and they put a shock wave sensor at a certain distance from that explosion. And they measured the PSI once that shock wave went through the sensor. And I think the first time they tried it was 40 pounds per square inch. So then they said, all right, well, let's test the myth. So they got 2 5-pound bags of explosives, and they put the sensor right in the middle, equidistant between one and the other, and they set them off at exactly the same time, and they measured what happened when the two shock waves met. Do you think it was equal? Well, it was, except from 40 psi with one explosion, it was 100 psi when they met. The moral of this story is, if you see 2 explosions happening at the same time, run away. Don't stand in the middle. So I was watching that, and later on I thought, I think about these verses, of course, all week, and I probably most of you, like me, at some point during a day, or absolutely during a week, you cross a bridge in Eau Claire. Somewhere. For me, the one I cross the most is when you turn onto Claremont from Menominee, right, and go across the river that way. That's the one I hit the most because it's between home and here. And so I got to thinking about their experiment. I also got to think about bridges. Because you see, the funny thing about bridges is every time we cross a bridge, we only have one perspective. Right? So for me, when I'm leaving home, I have the perspective from west to east. And when I'm coming back from Trinity, I have the perspective from east to west. But it's physically impossible for me to have both perspectives at the same time, because I can't be in 2 places at the same time. I guess if I had a little camera in my car, with the multiple views on the screen and expensive cameras that showed both views of that bridge, well, then I guess maybe I could see what it looked like, but I couldn't experience it at the same time. Like that experiment, I couldn't experience the push from both sides. And that's the funny thing about bridges. You see, because when we think about bridges, we tend to get all sorts of thoughts and ideas. Because on the one hand, bridges are all pretty much the same. They go from A to B and then from back to B to A, and they're connectors. But then we look at some of the bridges here that I picked out. If you look in the upper left, you may not recognize that bridge, but we blew it up years ago. That's a bridge in Basra in Iraq. This is the rebuild. So sometimes a bridge is not quite complete. We see it and we see only part of it, and it's on its way to being completed. The one in the upper right you might recognize, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which first became famous for a civil rights march that crossed it. This one is the one on the anniversary of that march, 50th anniversary of that march. So sometimes bridges are very symbolic, right? Sometimes the bridges that we cross, whether they're actual bridges or, if you've ever had a Cub Scout in your life, you'll know that one of the ceremonies going from being a Cub Scout to a Boy Scout is to cross a literal bridge, the arrow of light and all that. So sometimes bridges, whether they're real or symbolic, hold real power. Getting from A to B isn't just from A to B, it symbolizes something that's far more remarkable. Now, in the lower left, who knows what that is? It's not the London Bridge. The London Bridge was sold and was replaced in Arizona. That's the Tower Bridge. It's easy to get confused. Sometimes bridges are very ornate and iconic, as some people say, and yet, like that one, we can confuse them for something they're not. Right? A lot of us have crossings in life, and we think one thing is happening, and when in fact something else is happening at the same time. So we think we know exactly what we're looking at with a bridge, but we're not so sure. And the final one there in the lower right-hand corner is the Kinzua Bridge, or what's left of it. Sometimes the bridges in our lives, right, they just fall down. They're not used, or they're not kept up, right? I think recently when we first moved to Eau Claire, they were finishing the bridge at Water Street, because I guess it must have been in bad shape. Now it's in great shape, right? Got rebuilt. This one, not going to get rebuilt, because times change, bridge technology changes. You can kind of see, if you look closely in the lower right-hand corner there, the rest of the bridge that's fallen. So bridges are funny things because, as you can see, they represent all sorts of things. They represent brokenness. They represent rebuilding. They represent symbols, powerful symbols. They represent sometimes what we think and sometimes what we don't think. But we all cross them, especially here in Eau Claire, because we got a lot of water. We got a lot of things to go over. And of course, all this talk about explosions and bridges made me think of Jesus. Of course. I mean, why wouldn't that be the natural leap? And Lent, frankly. Because you see, Lent and Easter remind us of God incarnate, God living, God real, not off in the heavens somewhere as all the gods were thought of at that time. Not a God who's distant or absent or not at all interested, but God real, God in this place. And for the history of time, pretty much up to that time, there was no bridge to God. There was no way to access God in a very real way. There was no way to see God. There was no way to experience God. There was no way to touch and understand God in a way that humans could understand. And then Christ arrived. Jesus arrived in the midst of the world and said, "Do you want to see God? Look. Do you want to understand God? Follow me," he says, last week and this week. Follow me. You want to get from point A to point B and understand who God is, both and at the same time an icon, a symbol, the falling apart and the building up. God is all of those things, and we see all of those things in Jesus. He is the bridge from us to God. And, importantly, from God to us. Because we remember from the Bible, you get too close, like the Ark of the Covenant, you get too close to God, what happens? You die. In the God form, right? Humans we can't take it. Our senses, our mortal bodies, we can't take, physically, literally cannot take that close experience with God. So Jesus came to us and said, this you can understand. And Jesus is not on one side or the other. He's fully human, fully divine. He's point A and point B, and he's in the middle. And why is it important for him to be in the middle? Because when the power of God explodes on one side and the power of the human community that we call congregations and people is on the other side, when those two powers go off, it's more than just one or the other. It's a combination of both, and both are bigger than the sum of the parts. Remember, it was only 40 psi from one and 100 from two. That's more than the sum of its parts. And when we see what's possible, whether it's in Lent or Easter or wherever it is, when we see what is possible, when God breaks into our world and when we break into God's, and the kingdom meets in the middle, there's nothing that can stop us. Nothing. So I don't know what kind of bridge you're walking right now. Might be one like one of those. But I guarantee you, because this is the human experience, you're moving from point A to point B, or maybe from B to A. Who knows? But what I want to tell you is on that bridge, you will find Jesus walking along with us. And we are called to follow him. Called to follow him when it feels like we're going to drop off the edge. And called to follow him when it feels like it's majestic and symbolic and everything in between. He says, follow me to the cross. And in the next 2 weeks, that's just what we're going to do. Follow him to the cross. But I guarantee you, the power of God and that following, when it meets in Jesus, is going to be overwhelming. So stay tuned. Amen.